Hi there, I'm Heath, and today we're going to be talking about why there should not be a Dungeons & Dragons movie, and if there is one, what they can do to absolutely guarantee that the movie will be a catastrophic pile of garbage that plunges into the abyss of failure. Before making this video, I decided that I should at least run a Google search on Dungeons & Dragons movie to see if there was in fact something in the works. What follows has been my opinion on a Dungeons & Dragons movie for a long time, and has nothing to do with any particular idea that any movie studio might happen to have in development. I was hoping that there wasn't going to be one, although I thought I recalled some kind of vague rumors about a Dungeons & Dragons movie a while ago. Likely it was a project that was in development to try to ride the coattails of the fantasy resurgence that happened a while back ago. And lo and behold, when I was running the search, at least according to Wikipedia, there was a D&D movie that was supposed to have come out in 2021, but because of COVID and for other reasons, it's been delayed until March of 2023. So it might be that we are going to get one, and I'm here to explain why such a thing should not exist. It's really not something that I want to have to suffer through. So my position is that there should not be a Dungeons & Dragons movie. That is because, at the core of things, D&D is a role-playing game. It's not a story, and it's not a setting. Yes, I know that at different times and different iterations of the game, there has been bleed over in the core rules between the game system and the assumptions of a default game world, like with Greyhawk for 3rd edition. But generally speaking, Dungeons & Dragons is a game. The DM comes up with his own world, or can get a multitude of different supplements for different campaign settings. The characters are the players, and it's the story of those characters in the world that is created at the table. Therefore, if someone were to come up to me and say they wanted to make a movie about Dungeons & Dragons, this is making a movie about a game. What substance is there to that? There isn't any. One of the many problems that plagued the last Dungeons & Dragons movie when they dared to try to make one is that it was such generic fantasy. If the Dungeons & Dragons movie is synonymous with generic fantasy, it will fail, even if it is packed with references to things in the game, like people telling you that they use a longsword, and that they shout out the names of spells like Magic Missile and Color Spray. That's what happened with one of the most horrific movies I have ever seen, the World of Warcraft movie. It was one of only, I believe, 3 movies that I ever considered walking out of. I might have actually walked out of it, but I might have just strongly considered it, but endured it anyway. I can't remember, because I blocked that movie out of my mind. It was terrible. And of course, it is sad that it was that way, because there are only so many opportunities to make big-budget fantasy movies, and so we want them to land well. Some very die-hard Warcraft fans like the movie because of the references to the game, but that was far from anything needed to hold that movie together. And World of Warcraft even has a very well-defined setting going in its favor. That game is all about playing in Azeroth, and that world's history and geography and all of that. Dungeons & Dragons as a game system doesn't even have that. So, if there is an attempt to make Dungeons & Dragons as generic fantasy, then it will fail. We don't want to repeat the failures of the previous D&D movie and the World of Warcraft movie. So, don't make a Dungeons & Dragons movie. Instead, make a movie set in one of the worlds in which Dungeons & Dragons is played. Instead of making a single Dungeons & Dragons branded movie, each of the different worlds should get their own story arcs and franchises. Which would you rather have, a Dungeons & Dragons movie or a Forgotten Realms movie? For me, it's a Forgotten Realms movie hands down. Give me that. I am sure there are lots of people who would want to see, for instance, a Dritz Duerden movie. Dragonlance is another great one. They already have so many stories set in the world of Dragonlance. Do them. Don't do a generic D&D movie. As a writer and a storyteller, my mind already gets thinking about what could be going on in the story when one wants to talk about a Forgotten Realms movie or a Dragonlance movie, much more so than if I were told, hey, write a D&D movie. I do understand that from a business perspective, the Dungeons & Dragons brand name carries a lot of weight, and brand identification is a huge thing. I'm sure there are some people in the corporate boards of movie production studios that just want to be able to put the brand Dungeons & Dragons on a film. While the gaming community no doubt recognizes Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance, and so will some fantasy readers, they're not immediately recognizable brands to the public, as is Dungeons & Dragons. I recognize that this is a negative, But I counter that you can indeed have both. Just as we had The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, and The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, you can have Dungeons & Dragons, The Legend of Dritz Duerden, or Dungeons & Dragons, The Magic of Elminster, or something similar for Dragonlance. Those are not specific titles or story recommendations, by the way. I was just throwing those out there as branding examples. If this were adequately explained to somebody who was in charge of making movies at a studio, I would think that from a business perspective, studio execs would like the idea of being able to spread the D&D brand name over multiple franchises anyway. Then there's also the added bonus that since all of these worlds exist in the same universe, and that you can travel between them, there is an opportunity for the characters to meet one another in much later movies to deal with universe-wide threats, like the Avengers were brought together after their individual movies. But actually, I don't advocate that right now. I don't think I would go that route. I would keep the storylines of the heroes in each world separate, but you can't deny that something like that as an ultimate goal might be potentially interesting to a business executive. Now, here is what you do if you want to absolutely ruin a Dungeons & Dragons movie for sure. Start the movie off by having people playing Dungeons & Dragons here in the real world and then have them get sucked into the game. That would be absolutely terrible. You cannot make a good fantasy movie that way. Can you imagine starting the movie like that, with the players suddenly sucked into the PHB to find themselves in a generic fantasy game world trying to get out? Actually, there is a way that you can make that even worse. Here's how it would go. The Game Master shows up for the weekly D&D gaming night with an old book he wants to use during the game. It's some kind of rare book from First Edition that he found in the attic. The players object to using the book because it looks way too hardcore, but he's the Game Master and so he gets his way. Of course, it's a magical book, and when they use it at the table, all of the players get sucked in where they find themselves in this generic fantasy world. Of course, the book exists in the fantasy world as well, where it has some kind of power and falls into the hands of an evil wizard who needs it to cast a powerful spell. The PCs are now the main characters and heroes of the fantasy world, of course, and they have to steal the book back from the wizard in order to cast the spell that will return them to their gaming table. You think that's bad? Hang on, we can make this even worse. Of course, the character who was the Game Master is the one that none of the other characters trust anymore in the fantasy world because it's his fault for bringing that book to the table anyway. This world also happens to be the one that the Game Master created, and that's why it's so generic fantasy, and so he, of course, sympathizes with the evil wizard who was an NPC that he created for the game. So of course, he wants to ally with the wizard so he can remain here in his fantasy world forever and not go back home. The players have to convince him to help defeat the evil wizard and return them to the normal world. I don't even want to think about how terrible that would be. It took me all of 90 seconds to come up with that, the worst fantasy movie idea ever. In fact, I've got to stop thinking about it or it's going to hurt my brain. But you know there are people out there who would try to make that. You know there is some crazy studio executive out there who knows almost nothing about this, who's thinking, you know what all these geeks would love? A movie where they get pulled into their D&D game. Absolutely not. It makes me want to vomit. If there are any studio heads watching or listening, under no circumstances should you make that movie. None. So those are my reasons as to why there should not be a generic Dungeons & Dragons movie. If someone's going to try it, they have to tie the movie meaningfully to a certain world and then craft a quality story within that world. And whatever you do, don't do any sucked into the game nonsense. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, please come visit my YouTube channel. I've got a lot more videos there on tabletop gaming and fantasy that you should also check out. I look forward to seeing you in another video.